This is part 3, the trinity of my Kurdistan video conflict video. I hope that made sense. If for whatever odd reason you have not seen part 2, please watch part 2 and then watch part 3 so it makes sense. But if on a weirder note, you've watched part 1 but not part 2 and you're just hopping into part 3, you know what, just watch this and then watch part 2 because clearly you don't care about time. And for whatever reason, if you haven't watched part 1 or 2 and you're just gonna hop into part 3, then you're gonna be lost for sure. But no more time talking, let's hop into part 3. Now the KDP group tended to control these border crossings with Turkey, leaving the PUK kinda left out. This growing anger between the KDP and the PUK over this border crossing and all the money that's made from said border crossing would only sour the relationship between the KDP and the PUK. And seeing how both of these guys have armed groups, both of these guys are practically 50-50 cut in Parliament would stop working, and before you knew it, armed wings of the KDP and the PUK would engage in gun battles between each other. And side note here, when two of your major political parties are having shootouts with each other, your country may or may not fall into a civil war. The KRG would fall into a civil war. And as the civil war continued, foreign powers would also be involved. The PUK would end up getting Iranian support during the war, while the KDP would end up allying with Iraqi forces and even have Iraqi forces with the KDP push into the city of Erbil to push out PUK forces. You would even see Turkey re-enter northern Iraq to conduct operations with the KDP to fight against the PKK and the PUK. That operation did not force the PKK out of northern Iraq. Now the Iraqi-Kurdish civil war would last from 1994 to 1997. During this time, supporters of the KDP or the PUK would be forced to leave areas that were now controlled by the KDP or PUK. Now the civil war would end in 1998 when Barzani and Talabani would sign a US mediated peace agreement between, the KDP and the PUK. In this agreement, the parties would agree to share revenues between each other along with sharing power between each other, and they would deny the PKK from using northern Iraq, along with not allowing Iraqi troops to enter the Kurdish region. The US in return for accepting this peace deal would pledge military support for the Kurds from any attack from Saddam Hussein. I should state that during the Kurdish civil war period, and to be honest, during the transfer of camps within the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon to northern Iraq, and also during the general, somewhat collapse of the Iraqi government after the Persian Gulf War, the PKK would begin to move more of their camps in northern Iraq into the Kandil Mountains. Instead of making one big, PKK camp, the PKK would just make a lot of small PKK camps within the Kandil Mountains. I should state that as of the writing of this and the editing and probably upload of this, the PKK is still within the Kandil Mountains. But up north in Turkey, things were still intense. Many political Kurdish activists were found killed, suspected to be killed by the Turkish state or by far-right militias. Many politically active Kurds would also find themselves at times insulted and accused of terrorism while being isolated by fellow Turkish politicians and parties. The PKK during, the conflict in southern Turkey would also bump into the Islamist Kurdish separatist group called Turkish Hezbollah, aka Kurdish Hezbollah, aka Hezbollah, and before someone asks, no, they don't have links to the Lebanese Hezbollah. No surprise here, but these two groups would come into conflict with each other. I mean, one is a hardcore leftist group and the other one is a hardcore Islamist group, so yeah, conflict was most likely going to happen. The Turkish government of course wasn't sitting by and letting all this violence just grab southern Turkey. Turkey still had the upper hand in military hardware where they used it to kill many PKK fighters. I should also state that the PKK at this time would see a huge rise in recruitment, and for those that don't know, combat has a very steep learning curve where if you fail, you die, and sometimes if you're just not lucky, you die. At this time, many new PKK fighters, especially those from urban centers, would be killed or desert the armed struggle as combat learning curve. For the Turkish military, big surprise here, they didn't see that much difference at times between armed Kurdish fighters, Kurdish right activists, and Kurdish protesters. These were all seen as people who were trying to rip the unity of the nation. Remember, Turkey, and especially the Turkish military and hardliners within the government, at this time, and kind of still today, are highly nationalistic. For some of these people, these weren't even Kurds, these were still mountain Turks. What the hell is a Kurd, they would say. This, of course, no surprise here, would only drive more resentment within the Kurdish community and would drive PKK support within mountain Turk areas. During this rise of recruitment, you would also see the rise of female PKK fighters. This was very shocking to many conservative and rural Kurdish folks, especially those in southern Turkey. Women at times tended to have a less confronting or more upfront role in social life. One example I've seen put up a lot are stories of Kurdish women, finding out that they're going to be placed into a forced marriage. These women, of course, wouldn't want to be in these forced marriages, and they would flee to the mountains to join the PKK. For many Kurdish women that joined the PKK was seen as a escape from that type of life. The PKK has very complex views on gender conflicts, women empowerment, and trying to create what they view as equality between the genders. The PKK had and still has female fighters and field commanders, and later on people who followed Abdullah Öcalan's viewpoint would end up forming female armed wings like the YPJ. To many Kurdish women that went to join the PKK or looked up to the PKK, they were seen as a form of gender liberation. Now I'm for sure someone thinks this video is now too political. I'm going to really stress now that southern Turkey was a war zone though. The Turkish government would begin to ramp up collective punishment towards Kurdish villages, especially after PKK attacks were conducted, or if they're suspected of having PKK sympathies and were supplying the PKK. One way the Turkish government would pick pro or anti-PKK Kurdish villages was down to how many village guards they had. I should state that village guards were something that was highly controversial within Turkish Kurdish circles. Now, on the international scale, the PKK would also see a rise of support within Europe. Remember all those Kurds and Turkish leftists that had to flee Turkey and later on go into Europe? Well, they would also establish themselves there too. Many in Europe would rally the causes of Kurdish rights and self-determination, and even some of these guys and gals were supportive of the PKK. On the Turkish side of this PR, vague anti-terror laws were made that kind of censored, fine, rated, and shut down journalists that critiqued or gave criticism towards Turkey's counter-terrorism policy. Even with southern Turkey, being a war zone, Kurdish activists really rallying things up for the Turkish government. The Turkish government enacting, very vague anti-terror laws and, just at times general violence. The Turkish government would at this time also show that it had a possibility of reform and opening peace negotiations. Turkey at this time was led by President, sorry if I butcher his name, Turgut Özal. Now, President Özal was known for really pushing for lifting the ban on the Kurdish language that we saw and talked about earlier. And he seemed like someone who was willing to challenge the current Turkish policies towards the Kurdish population. He was seen by the PKK as a Turkish president that was genuine about a road to peace. Heck, Turgut Özal would even work on ending the denial of the Kurdish identity by the Turkish government and, stop calling these Kurds mountain Turks because they are actually Kurds. They are mountain Kurds. Okay, I'll walk myself out, that wasn't a funny joke. Abdullah Öcalan would feel that, this guy was really about it, and he would declare a ceasefire. This ceasefire had about a general, 3 aspects. And the first one was that this ceasefire was unconditional. The second one was that the PKK would have no intentions of separating from Turkey, and that this conflict should be resolved within nationally agreed borders. I should also state that the HEP was involved in the peace negotiation process with the PKK and the Turkish government, which would then, later lead to the prolonging of this ceasefire declared by the PKK. This isn't, of course, me saying that every single fight and shootout and things of that sort stopped in southern Turkey. Of course, there were still cases of this happening, but, compared to the previous years, this was, peaceful. There was less rioting and less clashes, less bombings and raidings and things of that sort. So now this isn't me saying that, Abdullah Öcalan and President Turgut Özal were like in cahoots. Of course, both of these guys still had issues between each other, as they're both on opposite sides of this conflict, and negotiations, take time. But it seemed like both of these guys wanted a political process, to begin and possibly end this conflict. But the peace wouldn't last forever. In April 1993, President Turgut Özal would die, and I should state that there is this theory that Turgut Özal was killed by the Turkish military in a secret coup because he was really pushing this peace process But I'm gonna be honest, this is above my pay grade of like 50 cents per video to really put my opinions on it. What I do know that really happened is that the Turkish president Turgut Özal would die unexpectedly, and that hardliners within the Turkish government did not really like negotiating with the PKK, and that they supported a military solution to the conflict, and the ceasefire would begin to fall apart. Turkish troops would begin to launch more operations against the PKK, and in May 1993, the PKK would ambush and kill 33 unarmed Turkish soldiers, which is known as the, sorry if I butcher this, Bengal Massacre. And this massacre was led by Semdian Sekik. I'm sorry if I butchered it. He's also known as Simo. And this massacre is seen as like a turning point in the war. And you also do have a lot of talks about how the PKK leadership was not actually prepared or planned this massacre, and that it was independently committed by Simo. You also have very layered things of people reporting that this attack was just a part of the secret Turkish military coup to lead the PKK into a bigger conflict with Turkey, but once again above my pay grade. But what I do know what really happened is that 33 people were massacred, and that this was a huge turning point for the war, as now the war really ramped up. I know I was stressing that southern Turkey was a war zone before, but this massacre would only drive Turkish hardliners to clamp down on the PKK, while the PKK would kind of realize that, oh damn, they just angered a whole bunch of hardliners and they really gotta fight or die. Turkey would begin new and more aggressive military attacks against the PKK, kicking off new scales of brutality. The Turkish military especially now felt that a tactical and military solution would end this war. More soldiers, more weaponry, and newer tactics were used against the PKK, and they were effective at times. The PKK would find themselves being pushed back into the mountains of Turkey, with this new Turkish military being all energized and stuff. This isn't to say that everything went well for Turkey. Turkey would still find itself losing control and stability of southern Turkey. Kidnappings would increase, target killings of government workers including teachers would increase, you'd see the shutdown and attacking of government buildings like schools, ambushes against Turkish convoys would intensify, and more isolated Turkish positions would be overwhelmed by PKK fighters. Turkey's response to this was to attack and besiege Kurdish villages that were suspected of harboring PKK fighters or pro-PKK sentiment. At times you'd see shelling of Kurdish villages, shooting into Kurdish villages, at times looting and airstrikes of Kurdish villages, especially those, that were suspected of supporting the PKK. And like I said earlier in the video, how Turkey measured pro and anti-PKK villages was by how many village guards they had. And like I said, but I'll stress again, the village guard system was not popular with the Turkish Kurdish population. During this time, the Kurdish population would begin to flee from these attacks and were forced to leave by the Turkish military. This would lead to the depopulating of many Kurdish villages and of Kurdish areas. While Turkey would begin to organize their troops and, modernize their troops and train them how to fight and hold positions against the PKK, due to depopulations and now Turkish troops setting up positions between villages, the PKK would now find themselves losing connection to sympathetic Kurds within, these combat areas. The same mountains that the PKK used to keep Turkey out, Turkey now used to keep the PKK in, while the pro-Kurdish Rights Party HEP would later on be banned in 1993, and many more Kurdish activists were assassinated but highly suspected by the state. Turkey was now really giving a hardline approach to the PKK, more hardline than before. While southern Turkey was heating up, in Europe things were also heating up as many political Kurds were still raising awareness for the Kurdish struggle. Heck, the PKK was even able to lobby support and get money from these Kurdish populated areas. The PKK was pretty intense in Europe that at times they would find themselves being banned in a good amount of European countries. The new Turkish approach began to take its toll on the PKK. The PKK group was running out of ammo, food, fighters. Very simple things, even batteries they were running out of. During this time, Abdullah Öcalan wanted to, organize a new Kurdish army and began to put blame on these rogue, overzealous, and incompetent field commanders. But the PKK at this time wasn't able to form an organized army. Abdullah Öcalan at times was giving orders that didn't reflect the military situation that the PKK was now in. PKK commanders at times were shocked but really couldn't oppose Abdullah Öcalan's orders, and attempts to debate these orders were ignored or were blamed on incompetent field commanders. On the other side, Turkey was being supplied by European and US governments. Once again, Turkey is a NATO ally and is also one of NATO's strongest allies. Just compare the guerrilla warfare PKK to the conventional, trained, and equipped Turkish military. That's how the situation was in southern Turkey. At one point in 1996, the PKK fight got really desperate. You would even see female suicide bombing become a tactic against Turkey. Turkey would of course try to begin more operations in northern Iraq, but the PKK just kept on standing. And I mean, things seemed pretty bleak for the PKK, but the group still stood against Turkey. And why? That's because, Turkey still had a huge Kurdish population and that many Kurds felt oppressed by the current government. Simply displacing, massacring, scaring, and bombing the Kurdish population wasn't going to solve the issue. Even with the PKK on the ropes, or I guess in the mountains per se, Turkey's policy towards the Kurds would only continue to fuel the conflict, and in the international level, many opinions would sway against Turkey. Popular support began to lean towards the Kurds. I mean, if you're reading on the news, human rights abuses from a NATO member with supplies from European nations, that just seems like normal news. But Turkey did try to reform its policy towards Kurds. Now, how far should have these reforms gone? Well, that's up for debate. An opinion was shifting against Turkey when Turkey wanted to join the EU. Turkey during this time would begin to reform its anti-terror laws, which were used to silence internal criticism and opposition to Turkey's policy towards the Kurds. I should state that these reforms and anti-terror law reforms, didn't go that far. I mean, very recently, British journalist Jake Hammerhand from Popular Front got arrested via these laws for reporting on Kurdish groups within Jizra. Now back to the PKK, which was now finding itself being divided between leaders. Many of the Turkey-based and military commanders were being ordered to do things that just felt impossible by the mostly politically minded Syrian-based commanders. The orders given from Syria were not reflecting the situation in Turkey, as the situation changed so much as time went on. One of these leaders within the split was Semdian SHEIKH. Sorry if I butcher your name. He's also known as Simo. Now, Simo had been fighting against Turkey since the 1980s for the PKK. He made his way up the PKK leadership by being one of the most formidable commanders, in Turkey. I should also state that Simo was in charge of the Bengal massacre, which was one of the many things that helped destroy the ceasefire between the PKK and Turkey, and I should state that the PKK leadership too was shocked by this massacre. Abdullah Öcalan and Simo would begin to see a divide between each other. As time went on between Abdullah Öcalan and Simo, Abdullah Öcalan would order Simo to begin operations in Hayat. Simo would see this Hayat order as a suicide order. During this time, Simo and Abdullah Öcalan were, having back and forth and debates over, the new tactics they should use. And to cut it short, Simo did not follow these orders and he was arrested by the PKK for, deserting his post. Simo would then defect from the group and seek protection in Iraqi Kurdistan with the KDP, but later on, Turkish special forces would arrest him in northern Iraq. I should state it is suspected that Simo gave very important information about the PKK when he was captured, and Simo would also state that the Bengal massacre was used by the Turkish deep state in this big military coup and things of that sort, but once again, above my pay grade. Things in Syria were also not looking good for the PKK. During this time, Turkey would begin to build up on the Syrian border and were now putting pressure on Hafez al-Assad to give up Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK or face military actions by Turkey. No surprise here, Hafez al-Assad did not want to see Turkish military operations begin in Syria, as that might lead to a bigger war with Syria. Syria would then kindly ask Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK to piss off. Abdullah Öcalan would see the writing on the wall and he would move. Move is putting it lightly, he kind of ping-ponged around the world. Abdullah Öcalan would move to Russia, and then he'd move to Rome where he was arrested very shortly. No surprise here, as Abdullah Öcalan would move around the world, Turkey got pretty mad. In Turkey's eyes, anyone that took Abdullah Öcalan was a foreign state allowing a baby-killing terrorist separatist leader in charge of the PKK group to, have safety in their borders and avoid justice. From Italy, Abdullah Öcalan would then go back to Russia, and then Abdullah Öcalan would go to Greece. and Greece would kind of rush Abdullah Öcalan out to Kenya. Well, why all the ping-ponging and no one wanting to take Abdullah Öcalan? Well, for the countries that border Turkey, Turkey is a strong military country, and if you bordered Turkey and had Abdullah Öcalan, there was a possibility you might get invaded or see a military operation against you. And on the more, broader scale of the world, Abdullah Öcalan was seen as a terrorist by many people. So it would probably be a huge PR disaster if you harbor a terrorist while pissing off Turkey. And I mean, Turkey would use its political and economic weight, to try to change the minds of these countries. Now, another PR disaster for countries would be arresting and putting Abdullah Öcalan on trial, or worse, handing him over to Turkey. No nation wanted to be the country that handed Abdullah Öcalan to Turkey that was filled with human rights abuses against its Kurdish population. Heck, many people were, and still are, very sympathetic to the Kurdish cause. Now, one country that did not mind all that PR stuff was the United States of America, that would help Turkey find Abdullah Öcalan in Kenya. Now, I should also state that some people do believe that the Israeli Mossad also helped with the arrest of Abdullah Öcalan, but above my pay grade thing again, so let's move on. With close to no government wanting to accept the controversies of accepting Abdullah Öcalan, he would kind of leave Kenya. On his way to the airport, the truck that was driving him would take a wrong turn, and then Abdullah Öcalan would realize the situation he was in, as the people in front of him weren't his people. Abdullah Öcalan would then be captured in Kenya by Turkish special forces, with the help of the United States. When first the news broke out and then photos were released of Abdullah Öcalan being surrounded by a bunch of Turkish special forces guys, many people supportive of the Kurdish cause would be saddened by this news. Different forms of protests would break out within Turkey, Iran, and Iraq over the capture. And this is where the rumor would break out of Israeli involvement within the capture of Abdullah Öcalan, but once again above my pay grade. Within Europe, you would also see protests. 3 Kurds would be shot dead and 16 would be wounded by Israeli consulate guards in Germany after Kurds would try to storm the consulate. You would see cases of self-immolation too. For many people who supported the Kurdish cause, blame would be placed on European nations for turning their back on Abdullah Öcalan when he needed it. The US would also see anger and protests against it as it sold weapons to Turkey and helped in his capture. To a lot of Kurds, even Kurds who disliked them, Abdullah Öcalan was now seen as a symbol of the Kurdish struggle. He now reached a level where he was seen as an embodiment of the Kurds fighting for equal rights within Turkey. Now, within Turkey, Abdullah Öcalan, did have a right to a trial. I mean, Turkey really wanted to put him on trial. Now, how fair was this trial? I'll just say this. Abdullah Öcalan lawyers at times were turned away and were only given 20 minutes to an hour to talk to him twice a week if the weather was good enough. How fair are the trials? I'd give it a out of 5. And there's other things of this sort which, barred Abdullah Öcalan from his lawyers and trying to form a defense throughout the trial. Now, I'm gonna go out on a guess and say even if Abdullah Öcalan did have more time with his, lawyers and all that, he would still be charged with treason, separatism, and then given the death penalty and banned from public office for life, which did happen in our timeline. He got charged for all of this. After, his sentence, Abdullah Öcalan would call for peace in southern Turkey, asking for the PKK to halt operations, and he would even ask for high-ranking PKK commanders to surrender to Turkey. And these PKK commanders did that. I feel like this should still show the influence that Abdullah Öcalan had and still has over the current, Kurdish struggle. Even in jail, this man could still influence things. Now you might be asking, well, why did he do this? Well, Abdullah Öcalan was trying to show goodwill to Turkey and the desire for peace talks between Turkey and the PKK, but Turkey was not in the mood for peace talks. While in jail, Abdullah Öcalan would read more theory and get access to more ideas from around the world. Due to this exposure of new ideas and readings he did while in prison, Abdullah Öcalan would begin to move away from the Marxist-Leninist viewpoint that he and the PKK followed. He would then begin to be introduced to anarchist and libertarian thoughts, and this would lead to Abdullah Öcalan creating a new idea called democratic confederalism. Now, sorry to any leftists I anger, I don't really read a lot of leftist theory, but I will try my best to get this because this is actually very important. I shouldn't screw this part up. Now, democratic confederalism in its most basic form, and a little bit with some Wikipedia research in a podcast episode or two, democratic confederalism is a libertarian socialist idea, revolves around the ideas of autonomy, direct democracy, environmentalism, feminism, multiculturalism, self-defense, self-governance, and a shared economy. Democratic confederalism also dislikes the idea of the nation-state. Abdullah Öcalan, during his character development arc and the creation of democratic confederalism, was heavily influenced by, I forgot the person's name, so they'll just show up on the video. Abdullah Öcalan would then move away from the ideas of the nation-state, and this would also include a Kurdistan nation-state. As in democratic confederalism, the idea of the nation-state is seen as a terrible idea, and that if a nation-state continues or is formed, and as it continues, it will end up oppressing a minority or gender group. On top of that, democratic confederalism also views the nation-state as something that reinforces the capitalist system. And for those that don't know, anti-capitalist people really dislike the capitalist system and would not want to help reinforce it. And now I need to state this because it's very, very important, but I'll also state that a lot of people take this with a huge amount of salt and don't trust this claim, and I kind of don't blame them due to the history the PKK has. But today, the PKK does claim that they aren't fighting for a Kurdistan nation-state. The PKK and other democratic confederalist groups in the Middle East now want to give an alternative to the current nation-state status quo, if that's even the correct term to use. I don't know what term to use when people want to give an alternative to the nation-state, but most countries and groups around the world want their own nation-state, and the nation-state is seen as something kind of natural. Even though it's something new, that is especially new in the Middle East. I mean, just go back to part 1. Let me stop blabbering. Now, this isn't me saying that democratic confederalism or groups that are trying to implement it simply say we're a bunch of people with guns and we oppose the nation state. They of course have ways of moving forward and organizing things. And the way how these things should be done through democratic confederalism, which would be through councils, parliaments, and of course election, with the aim of having direct involvement with the communities, where then these things would lead to more freedom and equality. Now, how much do people trust the PKK, or how successful will these endeavors be? It's none of my business and not the point of the video. And in 2005, the PKK would adopt the ideas of democratic confederalism. No surprise here, but when a group forms a whole new ideology, they tend to see splits, and the PKK would also see splits over this new idea. Many folks joined the PKK for the idea of an independent Kurdistan. Other folks joined it because, they wanted to see a communist Kurdistan be established. And this whole brand new idea of democratic confederalism, talking about the abolishment of the nation state because it's a reinforcement of the capitalist system, was very new to people. And some PKK fighters would feel that the PKK and Abdullah Öcalan were now missing, the original plot and were doing their own new show. As the PKK began to adopt and then enforce the ideas of democratic confederalism, you would see tiny splits and people would begin to desert from the PKK. Because, new idea and all that things. Turkey would also begin to see reforms towards the Kurdish population in this time. Kurds were now allowed to speak their language. Kurds were allowed to go to Kurdish language programs. The Kurdish language was also allowed back on TV, and public displays of Kurdish culture was allowed and no longer banned. Now, I should also state how far should have these reforms gone, or even how effective were these reforms, depend on whoever you ask. It's a spectrum of, high approval or low approval or just disapproval, depending on some folks you may ask. Because like most things, when you ask people's opinions on stuff, there's a spectrum to it. Some folks do think that these reforms were half-hearted, and in some cases, Kurds had to go through a series of bureaucratic laws and systems to gain access to these reforms. And it's highly suspected that Turkey did these reforms, in the hopes of joining the EU. I should also state that Turkey would get rid of the death penalty in 2002, which meant that Abdullah Öcalan would no longer have a death sentence, but now just had a life sentence in prison on his prison island. You would also see some back and forth between Turkish courts and the European courts of human rights over the trial of Abdullah Öcalan. No surprise here, Turkey wouldn't really budge on this issue and would keep Abdullah Öcalan in Turkey with a life sentence. Now, as the war with the PKK and Turkey, continued and went on, you would of course see the conflict in southern Turkey in these mountain ranges, but something new would happen. You would see protests and riots break out in western Turkey and in major Turkish cities. We can't forget that Turkey had displaced many Kurds during this conflict, and for the most part, their children, just like their parents and their parents, and I think you guys get the picture, still had some resentment against Turkey for its oppressive policy towards the Kurds. So Turkey would see an insurgency in the south and forms of protest and rioting in the west. Now, something very big happened in 2003 in the country of Iraq. And if you didn't guess, the US invasion of Iraq. Now, when the US invaded Iraq in 2003 and later on overthrew the Saddam Hussein government, Iraq, was kind of in a limbo, and the northern KRG would begin to organize itself with the new breathing room they had, while the rest of Iraq kind of fell into a civil war. We're so far into the modern era now that the next chapter is just so where is the Kurdistan conflict today? Well, since the Arab Spring, a lot has happened. Syria has fallen into a civil war, allowing the YPG, later on named the SDF, to take control of northern Syria in the fight against the Islamic State. Iraq also fell into a few civil wars where the KRG would fight against the Islamic State and for a short time tried a bid for independence but failed due to inter-Kurdish conflicts between the PUK and the KDP, along with a Iraqi assault on disputed regions between the KRG and the Iraqi government. And I mean, you don't have a independent Iraqi Kurdistan, but you still have the KRG. Turkey now finds itself trying to curb and destroy Kurdish troops with links to the PKK, like in Syria, like the SDF, as Turkey wouldn't want a PKK aligned group to be taking land right by its border. While within Turkey has also suffered internal, Kurdish revolts, like in the city of Jizre with the Kurdish group like the Yadirgi and, the PKK insurgency. And as the Syrian war continued, Turkey would find itself, being sucked into the conflict. Turkey now finds itself establishing safe zones in northern Syria. I should state that these safe zones are accused of depopulating the Kurdish population, trying to replace them with the Arab population of Syrian refugees in Turkey that, fled the Syrian civil war. I should also state that these Turkish-backed Syrian rebel groups have been accused of terrorizing the Kurdish population in these safe zones. To be honest, just terrorizing any populations, especially within the region of Afrin, where Turkey and these Syrian-backed rebel factions are accused of trying to target and depopulate the Kurdish population. Afrin now sees an insurgency against the Turkish-backed Syrian rebels. Now off to the SDF that controls parts of northeast Syria after the fall of the Islamic State and now names it Rojava, where they try to rule under the ideas of democratic confederalism. And while the FDS does state it does not have links to the PKK, they probably do. I should state at times that the FDS has been accused of trying to depopulate the Arab population, though the SDF would claim that they're a multicultural, multiracial, group and all that. And as of the writing of this, the Syrian government has, funny enough, found itself allied with the SDF against Turkey and Turkish-backed rebel groups. It should be stated that this SDF-Assad alliance is very unstable and has seen conflict break out between these parties, as Syrian Kurds, like, just many Syrians in general, protested Assad in the early days of the Syrian revolution and later on had to form their own armed groups due to the following Syrian government crackdowns. We also can't forget that Syria has oppressed their Kurdish population in the past, and the SDF does not want to see that happen again. The current alliance, if you could even call it that, has one very mutual understanding, and it is, we both hate Turkey and love the current stability we have, but I do not trust you any further than that. Turkey has also began operations and are now setting up military outposts in northern Iraq with the goal of, destroying these PKK camps, especially those in the Kandil Mountains. I should also state that the KDP and the PKK at times, have caught each other having more skirmishes and just more armed conflicts between each other. The PUK and the KDP leadership in the KRG within Iraqi Kurdistan are also highly corrupt. We would even see anti-corruption protests break out in Iraqi Kurdistan against the PUK and KDP, while Iranian Kurdish separatism is still an insurgency against the state. I should state now that, these things are always subject to change and will probably change, within like the next 2 to 3 years. But as of now, for the most part, and as of the recording of this, 7/26/2021, 1:13 a.m. in the morning, this is where I'm going to leave, the current video. But I think it's very important to stress that things can shift and probably will shift as, this video gets older. But as of 7/6/2021, 1:14 a.m. now, I'm gonna say one of my favorite sayings I say to people all the time. Hey man, I don't know, but we'll find out together.